To start working with the glaze that you copied, double click on it. It opens it up in a new window. What we want to do here is we want to take this glaze recipe and substitute new materials for the materials that we're using currently in the glaze. So what you do is you click on the batch calculation button. This takes your materials and turns them into a unity formula analysis. These are the oxides. This is where the clay is and the boron is, and over here we have the silica. My favorite button in all of GlazeChem is the Make Suggestion button. If I press on the Make Suggestion button, what it does is it looks at these oxide numbers and suggests materials I can use to source those oxides. And so the first suggestion it gives me is Cornwall stone. If I don't want that, I can hit the Make Suggestion button again and it will go down our list. Custer feldspar is already in the recipe. That's why the amount exactly matches the amount that we have in the recipe at this time. If I press Make Suggestion again, I could source part of this with Frit 3269. I could then hit Make Suggestion again and go to G200. So if I want to use this material, I just choose Use Material and it adds it to the recipe so far. If I change my mind about this material, I can undo the last material and it takes it out. Another thing you can do is you can change the amount of the material in the recipe just by typing in the value that you'd like and then choosing Use Material. So I'm going to start this process over again and choose Undo Last Material, and I'm going to go through the list and see what GlazeChem suggests for me. And so I'm going to use the G200. Then I'm going to repeat this same process. Right now GlazeChem is trying to source the boron in the glaze. And so it gives me a variety of choices I could use for that. I'm deciding that I'd like to go with Gerstley borate, so I'm going to use that material. Notice that when I chose the Gerstley borate added a little extra magnesium to this glaze. And it's a very small amount. It's 6/1000ths. And so if an oxide gets oversourced in the glaze, meaning that the material that you're putting in provides a little bit of an excess, you'll see a minus near that oxide. When it's a really tiny amount, like this trace amount right here, I don't even worry about it. Make Suggestion again, and it's still trying to source that sodium up here. And so what I'm going to do is I am going to use Frit 3110 for that, so I'm going to use the material. Then I'm going to Make Suggestion again, and it's going to give me whiting for the calcium, or wollastonite. Wollastonite as it was in the original recipe. If I don't wish to change wollastonite, if I like that, the way that material reacts in the glaze, I can just leave it in. So I'm going to use that material. But notice that the amount is different. That's because the other materials that I've put into glaze have added some of the oxides here. So GlazeChem is calculating that for you. Make Suggestion, alumina hydrate, china clay, EPK. What GlazeChem is looking at right now is the alumina, so I'm going to choose EPK. Then the next thing that it will try to source is the silica. And so when I choose Make Suggestion, it offers up flint, and I'm going to choose Use Material. Then lastly, in order to accept this recipe, you choose OK. Now I've got a few oxides over here that have been over-sourced a little bit by some of the materials I've chosen, but since the amounts are so small, I'm not going to worry about it. So now when I come over to my recipe, it gives me a total for my new recipe, and the recipe's got a significant amount of decimal point places after it. So in order to get this to be scaled to 100, I can just choose Scale to 100 grams, and it asks me if I'd like the recipe to add up to 100, and I would. But when it does that, it leaves me with all these extra decimal places, which are insignificant because my scales aren't that accurate. So I can choose Utilities, Round Off Amounts, and I'm going to round it to the nearest tenth. And so now you'll notice that the recipe size so far is 99.9. This is when I might go to the analysis screen, and I know that the flint in this recipe is a little bit off. So I'm just going to add a little bit of flint right here, and that brings me to 100 grams. Now, one of the things I can do is right now is I can save this revision. I can also save the Glaze database so I don't lose this revision. And then I can open up my original recipe and I can look at the analysis screen. And this gives me a breakdown of what is in my original recipe, and it shows me the unity formula. And so when I look at the unity and analysis screens in my new one of the things that jumps out at me is most of these values are fairly close to each other, so I'm not too worried about them. But the one that sticks out a little bit is that the silica level is significantly different from the original to the revision. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the recipe and I'm going to just add a tiny bit of flint to this to see if I can't get this to jump up. So right now I'm at 24.2. I highlight the 4.2 and I'm going to choose 26. So now the flint has jumped up to 3.34 and I want it at 3.41. So now I'm going to kick this up again to 30. Now the flint has gone a little too high, the silica's too high, so 30 is too much, so I'll try 28. 3.45, we're getting close. I'll try 27.5. 3.42, let's try 27.4. 3.41, now we've got a match on the silica. So now what I can do with my new recipe is I can rescale it to 100 because right now it adds up to 103. Choose yes. Then I can round off the decimal places by going to utilities and rounding off the amounts to the nearest 0.1. And so now I've got this little straggler right here, an extra 0.1 of the recipe. So I will just tweak this a little bit by taking off 1/10 of a gram of flint. It didn't change any of these numbers, and so these two recipes might be worth testing. Try one of them and try the other one in the same kiln and see if the fired results are the same. Now, for working batch size, if I would like to create a 400 gram batch of this, I can choose 400 right here, and this makes a working batch size that I could make up as a test. In order to see how much of this I would need, I'll go to print, and then I'll go to print Glaze report and I'll choose print preview. And so now I've got a preview of how much of these ingredients I would need to make this glaze. And so it gives me the total of the glaze as parts of 100%. Here's how much I need to make a 400 gram batch. If I entered some amounts of how much I paid for these chemicals into the database, it will tell me how much it costs to make this glaze. Here's the unity formula. Here's a cost summary of what each of these items cost. Here's the expansion of this glaze, and so this report will be pretty thorough. If all that I would like to do is print the recipe, I can go to print Glaze recipe, and go to print preview, and now I get a much smaller amount. A much smaller amount of information. I get a 100 gram batch, a 400 gram batch, how much to make a 1,000 gram batch, and how much I would need to make a 6,000 gram batch. And these numbers, the 1,000 and the 6,000, are numbers that I set in the preferences of this program. So this is how you can use GlazeChem to alter a glaze recipe and hopefully maintain the same fired characteristics using different materials.